Hello and welcome back to the Blush Studio. Today we're going to go over part 2 of this Stargazer Lily tutorial. In the first tutorial, which I'll have linked down below, I talked through mixing my color palette and also working in a looser style. So you can see where I left off. Everything that I'm working on today has been dried. And so I'm going to go through and we're going to talk about how you can make something that's a little bit looser, like this style, more realistic. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this purple color that I had mixed earlier and I'm going to start adding shadows. Now if you're working with looser watercolor styles, you don't really add the shadows in, you show depth through the opacity. So something that is lighter is going to fall into the back and you'll have that aerial perspective, while something that is darker will kind of come up to the front and demand your attention. If you're working in a more realistic style, then you need to start looking at, okay, where do these shadows fall? How do I show that this petal is coming up above the other petal? Because unlike in a looser style, it's more important to show that level of depth. I recommend, if you're working with shadows, mixing an analogous color. So an analogous color is a color that's next to each other on the color wheel. So for this pink flower, pink being a light version of red, purple will be right next to that, so that works really well. I also recommend looking for a cool tone color. So a cool tone color would be blue or green or purple. Colors that have those kinds of properties are going to visually fall back. That's just kind of a little trick that you can do with your viewer's eye, and while warmer colors will automatically come closer to the front of your composition. Now, as you can see, I am doing a little bit of repetition of what I did in the last video just to finish up this flower, but that will give the shadows that I already started a chance to dry, because it will take a couple of more layers. Really, the key with more realistic illustration styles with watercolor is layers or passes. So pass in art terms just means that kind of layers of painting. Let's skip ahead a little bit for the sake of just respecting your time. We're going to move on to more details. So I'm going to start off with the leaves themselves. For a couple of reasons, I like to start off with something that I'm not as afraid about. It just helps me to build up courage and to really find kind of my groove. So I'm just going through and adding these stripes to the leaves. Now, since this leaf is kind of isolated by itself, I do add a lot of detail in there, and I just continue to add shadows for the underside of the leaf and kind of mess with those stripes until they're as strong as I want them to be. I do pull in a little bit of the red into the green, and I like to work with a limited color palette, but also it helps to desaturate it a little bit, make it a little bit darker, and help it to pop a little bit. Now this leaf that I'm working on, because it is falling behind that other bloom, that lily, I don't want it to have as much emphasis. So you'll see that I didn't really add a whole lot of the stripes and the details to that, because I don't want it to distract from the lily right in front of it. But this petal, it has a little bit more emphasis. It's not falling back as much, so I'm going to give it a little bit more detail. And you'll see that kind of come and go. The two leaves on the lower left just don't have as much detail, while the other leaves will have a little bit more. Just based on how I want the eyes of my viewer to move and what I don't want them to be distracted by. So you see I'm adding some details here, and I will add the stripes in, but I won't add as much detail as I do to the flowers or the leaves that are isolated a little bit more on the right. Now, one thing that you're going to see me doing here is mixing different levels of the red and the green. So even though I did use the purple to create the shadows on the original Stargazer Lily, really my preferred method of mixing shadows and really working with paint in general is to use a limited color palette. So you can see that the same value that I use to kind of add some depth and dimension to the stem, I'm using that in the lily itself. And I just find that a limited color palette helps to create a more cohesive composition overall. So instead of creating a brand new color, a brand new shade of green, a brand new shade of pink or red, in adding that into my composition, it looks more purposeful if it kind of flows together. So you'll see as we go along, I'll be mixing a couple of different groupings. So see, I'm mixing another one just to get the level of green and red that I want for a specific area. So again, adding some shadows in there. So there's a lot of red in that color that I'm using for the shadow, but you'll see I'll mix a little more green in there, and that just helps It helps that they're complements, so red and green are opposites on the color wheel, so when you mix them together they make like a ruddy gray or brown, and so mixing those two together in order to create that shadow color is perfect. It really just helps to pull everything together and prevents everything from becoming muddy or standing out too much. So if I were to mix a brand new green and add it into these areas that I want the shadow, it might be a little too bright or a little too blue and just look out of place. So really the goal is to make everything look as purposeful as possible, especially when working with like a more realistic style. Some things that you can get away with when you're working with a looser, more modern watercolor style, it's much harder to get away with when you're working with something realistic because we know how it's supposed to look. So let's zoom in a little bit more here and you can see that I'm building on the shadows. So a shadow will be the darkest closest to the center or closest to the item that's touching it. So I really want it to be nice and dark right by those petals so that it looks like the petal just kind of comes up, and then it can kind of be diffused a little bit as it goes out. And then any of the stems or leaves that are going to be away from my light source, which in this case is more from the top of the lilies, is going to have a little bit more of a shadow. And then, like I said, this will be another pass over these shadows. So I told you it's going to take a couple of passes to build it up to where I want it to be. And I just kind of keep building it, keep adding that color in, and try not to overthink it. That tends to be my thing with watercolor, is I'm really good at overthinking or overworking a piece. So I'm just trying to add that color in slowly and get it up to the opacity that I want it to be. So here I'm adding in a light wash, and there's a little bit of green in kind of my pink, and that will just help to add a shadow, so you can tell that this is the underside of the petal, that the light isn't hitting it as well. Even though it's a lighter color for these stargazer lilies, the underside is very light. I do want to show that it is the underside, and so I'm adding that shadow in at the very base and allowing it to kind of build up in a gradient. Now another trick that I picked up from my watercolor days, and again working with that limited color palette, is I'm going to take a light wash of the pink, so it's a little bit of pink paint and a little bit of water, and I'm just adding that to this little bud over here, and that is just to kind of bring all the colors in together so that they're being found in different areas of the painting. I like to do this even if I'm working with a color that is, you know, very saturated in one area. I like to add it in elsewhere. Just again, it's kind of the same idea of that as that limited color palette, where I will pull things in and just give it a more cohesive look, and it's just more visually interesting. So you can see I'm going to be adding a little bit of the stem colors into the leaves just to kind of brighten that up, get a little bit more of that yellow into those green leaves and give them a little bit more life. And even though that's not necessarily in there in reality, it's just more visually interesting and it brings it all together, so it's not like this really saturated green black hole in your painting. So again, we're going to speed this up a little bit as I'm going to kind of be going over and just adding more passes. So I'm building up the color a little bit on these details, and one thing that really sets apart my more realistic pieces from my more modern, looser watercolors is that I don't really use as much strategic negative space. So I'll be filling in all of these sections with color, where on the last video, kind of that center part of each petal I kept empty, where this time I'm filling it in just because I don't need the negative space or the white space to help show the direction, because I'm adding those details and those shadows in to do that. You can still leave them there, but it's just not as necessary. It's not as strategic, and it might look more like a mistake if you have kind of a big white space in the center of your petal that wouldn't naturally be there. Alright, now we're going to start getting into the real fun, where we're adding those deepest, darkest shadows. So you can see I'm really going for the most neutral green that I can find and adding that to my lilies, and then we're also going to be adding these nice dark details. So you can't see it, but I'm just using the same colors that I have been. I mixed almost the same red that I was using, but I added a lot of the green to it. So it's a very neutral, ruddy red, and I'm just using that on my flowers to really help them to pop. Now off the top of my head, I can't remember if I had to go in and add another layer of paint in order to get to build up the value to be as dark as I want it to be. But I did keep that color kind of separate so that I would be able to do that if I needed to. And just kind of mixing more colors in there. I will be adding the details on the actual petals themselves, that just really iconic, those like freckles on the petals. There's probably a technical term, but I don't know what they are. This is tricky. It's really hard to get something that looks very random, but also purposeful. The biggest thing that I found, I just looked at the pictures and I really studied that for a moment before getting into the petals that I was working on, and I saw that they were directional and they kind of followed that negative space in the center, so there was like a section in the center of the petal that wasn't touched as much, and so I tried to avoid that while still pointing it towards the end of the petal. Remembering the purpose of them is to draw bees and other insects into the center so that they're able to pollinate the flowers. And so just kind of trying to mimic that and um, make sure that it was translating not only the beauty that it holds, but its function as well. But that was really fun. I really felt like that helped to bring everything full circle. Everything came to life and really popped at that point. And it was just really pretty. My original plan was to use the purple that I had mixed, or mix another purple, in order to show off these details, but I ended up, again, kind of mixing with a limited color palette and just using what I had been working with before. I just felt that that was a little bit more cohesive and more purposeful to what I was going for. Now, one thing that I always do is I give it some space. So all of my compositions, I wait until the next day before I send them to the client. Especially with watercolor, I find that the next day I just have a lot of clarity. Everything dries really different, and I've just found that I really needed to deepen some of these shadows up. So you'll see I'm going in with my detail brush, and I'm just working off of the palette that I had yesterday. I'm just deepening everything up, making sure that it really pops. You'll see that as I'm adding these shadows, it's almost like the petals jump forward, and I just love that. Especially with watercolor, allowing it to dry and giving yourself some space, some like mental clarity, really helps to point things out that you wouldn't necessarily notice. Plus, having just that detailed, dedicated time really helps me to build up those shadows to be as intense as I need them to be. Especially on these center bits, I found that I really needed to just kind of continue to build up those shadows. Yeah, see how that petal now in the front just really pops? I love that. And I'll give this a little bit of time to dry before I send it off to the client, and just to make sure that I really got everything. But I just found that giving yourself that space and that time will allow you to excel that much more. Now that we're reaching the end of this project, I'm dying to know, do you prefer this more realistic style, or did you prefer kind of the more modern, looser, a little bit messier style that we worked with last week? I'm really curious. I love working with both. I've loved the challenge of going more realistic, and I feel like it fits my overall aesthetic a little bit more, but I always go back to looser watercolors. I just love it. If you haven't done so already, please like this video, leave me a comment down below, and let me know what tip that I shared that you really appreciate. And don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Happy painting!